The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It fell in cold, steady sheets across the Lancashire countryside, turning the gravel roads around Bamber Bridge into ribbons of mud and the barrack yards into shallow lakes that reflected nothing but gray sky. Lieutenant James Harrington stood at the window of his temporary office in the requisitioned manor house, watching water stream down the glass in crooked rivuaries, and wondered how a place could be so endlessly wet. He'd been in England for 4 months now, transferred from a desk job in Virginia to oversee logistics for the 1511th Quartermaster Truck Regiment, and in all that time he had learned that the English summer was a lie, that the pubs closed too early, and that the war happening across the Channel felt both impossibly close and impossibly distant at the same time. He was 26 years old, a product of Harvard and a Philadelphia family that had expected him to practice law and not wear the uniform. But the war had swallowed those expectations the way it swallowed everything else. He had volunteered because it seemed like the thing a man of his position should do, and because sitting out the greatest conflict in human history felt cowardly in a way he could not explain to his mother, who wept when he left. Now he was here, in this damp corner of England, responsible for Negro soldiers who hauled supplies and drove trucks and lived under a military policy that treated them as lesser men, even as it demanded they serve their country. The irony was not lost on him, though he rarely spoke of it aloud. Officers who questioned segregation too loudly found their careers stalled or their assignments changed. The knock on his door came just after 1900 hours. He turned from the window, straightening his uniform jacket out of habit. "Enter." The door opened and Sergeant Willis appeared, his dark face glistening with rain, his expression troubled in a way that made Harrington's stomach tighten. Willis was a good man, steady and competent, the kind of NCO who kept things running when the chaos of war threatened to overwhelm the machinery of the army. But tonight his eyes held something that looked like fear. "Sir, we have a situation at the old Hob Inn," Willis said, his voice low and controlled. "MPs picked up Private Eugene Taylor about an hour ago. I just got word from one of the men who saw it happen. They say the MPs roughed him up pretty bad, sir. Real bad." Harrington felt the familiar knot of tension form between his shoulder blades. The military police assigned to enforce discipline among the black troops were almost exclusively white Southerners, men who brought their prejudices across the Atlantic like contraband and wielded their authority, with a cruelty that often crossed the line from enforcement to punishment. There had been incidents before, shoving matches, insults shouted in the street, black soldiers arrested on flimsy pretenses. But the tone in Willis's voice suggested this was something worse. "What was the cause?" Harrington asked, reaching for his cap. "He was drinking at the pub, sir, with some of the local girls. White girls." Willis hesitated, then added, "The British don't mind it, you know that. They treat our boys like human beings. But the MPs, they came in hot, started throwing their weight around, telling the girls to get away from the niggers." Taylor talked back, told them this was in Alabama. They dragged him out. Harrington closed his eyes briefly. He knew the pubs in Bamber Bridge, had been in them himself, had seen how the local English welcomed the black soldiers with a warmth that stood in stark contrast to the hostility they faced from their own white countrymen in uniform. The people here did not understand American segregation, did not see why men fighting the same war should be separated by the color of their skin. It created a strange inversion of the social order the army tried to maintain, and it drove the white MPs to fury. "Get my jeep," Harrington said. "I'm going down there." The drive through the village was treacherous, the narrow roads slick with rain and the blackout making navigation a matter of memory and faith. Harrington sat beside his driver, a young corporal named Matthews who had been with the 1511th since its formation, and watched the dark shapes of cottages slide past. Somewhere in the distance he could hear singing soldiers from the barracks, their voices carrying through the wet air. It sounded like a spiritual, one of those old hymns the Negro troops sang when they thought no officers were listening, full of sorrow and defiance in equal measure. They reached the MP station behind the old Hob Inn just before 2000 hours. It was a commandeered storage building, its windows boarded up and a single lantern hanging by the door, casting weak yellow light onto the muddy ground. 2 MPs stood guard outside, both young, both armed, both stiffening visibly when they saw an officer approaching. Harrington recognized neither of them, which meant they were from the 776th Military Police Battalion, the unit that had been causing most of the trouble. "Lieutenant," one of them said, his accent pure Georgia clay. He did not salute. "This is MP jurisdiction, sir. We got a prisoner being processed." "Private Eugene Taylor," Harrington said flatly. "I'm here to see him. He's one of my men." The MP exchanged a glance with his companion. In the lamplight, Harrington could see the mud on their boots, the rain darkening their uniforms. The second MP, older and heavier, stepped forward. His name tag read Bowen. "Prisoner's been resisting, sir. We had to subdue him. He ain't in a condition for visitors right now." "I didn't ask about his condition," Harrington said, keeping his voice level, though his pulse had begun to hammer in his temples. "I said I'm here to see him. Step aside." There was a moment of calculation in Bowen's eyes, a weighing of authority against instinct, of regulations against the unspoken rules that governed interactions between white and black, even among officers and enlisted men. Then Bowen shrugged, as if the matter was of no consequence to him. "Suit yourself, Lieutenant. But don't say we didn't warn you." He pushed open the door and Harrington stepped inside. The smell hit him first, blood and sweat and something sharper, like fear given physical form. The room was dim, lit only by another lantern hanging from a hook in the ceiling, its light swinging slightly and casting moving shadows across the walls. There were crates stacked in the corners, a wooden desk pushed against one wall, a few chairs. And in the center of the room, tied to one of the support posts with thick rope, was Private Eugene Taylor. Harrington stopped as if he had walked into a wall. Taylor was perhaps 20 years old, tall and lean, still wearing his uniform, though it was torn at the shoulder and soaked with blood and rainwater. His face was swollen, one eye completely shut, his lips split and leaking red down his chin. His hands were bound behind him around the post, the rope so tight it had cut into his wrists, and his head hung forward as if consciousness was something he was only barely maintaining. But it was the rest of it that made Harrington's breath catch, the bruises covering Taylor's arms, the blood matting his hair, the way his breathing came in shallow, ragged gasps that spoke of broken ribs. And pinned to his chest, crudely attached with a safety pin, was a piece of cardboard torn from a ration box, with a single word scrawled across it in black grease pencil: Defiant. For a moment, Harrington could not move. He had seen violence before, training accidents, brawls between soldiers. But this was different. This was calculated. This was meant to send a message. Behind him, Bowen spoke from the doorway. "Like I said, sir, he was resisting. We had to make sure he understood the consequences of defying authority. Colonel Henshaw himself said we needed to maintain discipline among these colored boys, keep them in line." This one needed a lesson. Harrington turned slowly. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet, which was somehow worse than shouting. "You tied a soldier of the United States Army to a post and beat him. You marked him like an animal. And you think that's discipline?" Bowen's face hardened. "With all due respect, sir, you don't know what it's like dealing with these boys. They get uppity, they forget their place. The British treat them like equals and it goes to their heads. They start thinking they can do whatever they want, drink with white women, sass and peas, act like they're the same as us. Someone's got to remind them how things really are." "How things really are," Harrington repeated softly. He looked back at Taylor, at the cardboard sign, at the blood. Something was building in his chest, a pressure that felt like it might crack his ribs from the inside. "Cut him down." "Now, sir, I don't think—" "That was not a request, Sergeant. Cut him down now, or I will have you arrested for assault of a fellow serviceman." There was a long moment of silence. Then Bowen made a dismissive gesture to the younger MP, who reluctantly came forward with a knife and began sawing through the ropes. Taylor slumped forward as the bindings fell away, and Harrington moved quickly to catch him before he hit the ground. The private's weight was solid against him, muscle and bone, warm and trembling. Up close, Harrington could see more damage burns on Taylor's neck that looked like cigarettes, more bruises disappearing under his collar. "Get Sergeant Willis," Harrington said to Matthews, who had followed him inside. "Tell him to bring the medic. And get Captain Foster. Want someone from the Judge Advocate's office here within the hour." "Sir," Bowen said, his voice rising now, anger replacing the earlier calculation. "You're making a mistake. This is an MP matter. We got authority to maintain discipline however we see fit, especially with colored troops. You bring the JAG into this and you're just going to cause trouble for yourself. These boys need a firm hand, and if you—" "Get out," Harrington said. He did not raise his voice, but something in it made Bowen stop mid-sentence. "Get out of this room right now before I forget I'm an officer and do something we'll both regret." Taylor stirred in his arms, a soft moan escaping his split lips. His one good eye fluttered open, unfocused, searching. "Lieutenant," he whispered. His voice was thick, the words slurred by pain and swelling. "They said ... They said I was defiant." "You're safe now," Harrington said, though he was not sure it was true. "I've got you." The next hours passed in a blur of activity and tension. The medic came, a thin Negro corporal named Washington who had been a medical student before the war, and he worked on Taylor with gentle efficiency while muttering a steady stream of curses under his breath. Captain Foster arrived, took one look at the scene, and immediately ordered photographs taken. NPS from a different unit stood guard outside, their presence necessary because word had spread through the barracks with the speed of wildfire. And soldiers from the 1511th were gathering in the rainy darkness, their voices low and angry, their numbers growing. Harrington stood in the doorway and watched them assemble. There were perhaps 50 men now, maybe more, forming a loose crowd in the muddy yard between the pub and the station. They were not shouting, not making threats, but their silence was somehow more ominous. These were soldiers who had been trained to fight, who had been told they were serving their country, who had endured segregation and insult and daily humiliation with a discipline born of necessity. But there were limits to what any man could bear, and tonight those limits had been reached. Sergeant Willis appeared at his elbow. Sir, we need to get Taylor out of here. The men are talking about storming the MP station, getting their own justice. I can't say I blame them, but if that happens, people are going to die. Where's Bowen? Harrington asked. He and his boys retreated to their barracks, called for reinforcements. Willis's face was grim. Sir, this is going to get worse before it gets better. You know how it is. The MPs aren't going to let this slide. They're going to see this as the colored troops getting out of line being a threat, and the Army's going to back them up because that's how the system works. Harrington knew he was right. He had spent enough time in the military to understand its prejudices, its hierarchies, its unspoken rules about who mattered and who did not. A beaten black soldier was a problem only if it threatened good order and discipline, which really meant only if it made white soldiers or white officers uncomfortable. The fact that Taylor had been tortured, that basic human decency had been violated, would matter less than the fact that his treatment had stirred up unrest among Negro troops. But knowing that and accepting it were different things. Get Taylor to the medical station, Harrington said. I'm going to talk to the men. He walked out into the rain and the crowd parted to let him through. Faces turned toward him, some hopeful, some skeptical, all of them waiting. These were men who had learned not to expect much from white officers, even the well-meaning ones, because good intentions dissolved in the face of Army regulations and Southern prejudice. But they were also desperate, and desperation made men willing to take risks. Harrington climbed onto a crate someone had left by the pub entrance. The rain soaked through his cap immediately, running down his collar, but he barely noticed. Below him the soldiers waited, a sea of dark faces in the darkness. I know what you're thinking, he said, pitching his voice to Carey. I know what you want to do. Private Taylor was beaten by MPs who should have protected him. He was brutalized and humiliated, and the people responsible are walking free while he's in the medical tent getting stitched up. You want justice. You want someone to pay, and you have every right to feel that way. There was a murmur of agreement, voices rising and falling like waves. Someone shouted, "They marked him like a slave, Lieutenant. Like we're still on the plantation." Others echoed the sentiment. Harrington held up his hand. I'm not going to stand here and tell you that this is acceptable. It's not. What happened tonight was criminal, and I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure the men responsible answer for it. But if you storm that MP barracks, if you take matters into your own hands, the only thing that's going to happen is you're going to give them exactly what they want. They'll call it a mutiny. They'll say you were out of control, that you proved everything they believe about Negro soldiers being dangerous and undisciplined. And then they'll use it as an excuse to come down on all of you harder than ever, so we do nothing, someone called out. We just let them beat us and mark us and treat us like dogs? No, Harrington said, we do it right. We follow procedure. We document everything. We file formal charges. We make so much noise that they can't sweep it under the rug. The British are watching. The newspapers are watching. The world is watching. And if we play this smart, we can make sure what happened to Eugene. Taylor becomes the last time any MP in this man's army thinks he can get away with that kind of brutality. He could feel the skepticism in the crowd, the doubt born of too many promises broken. Too many times they had been told to trust the system only to watch it fail them. But he could also feel something else, a desperate hope that maybe this time things could be different. I'm asking you to trust me, Harrington said quietly. Just for tonight. Give me a chance to do this the right way. And if I fail, if nothing comes of it, then you can decide what you need to do. But please, don't throw away your futures on a fight that's only going to end one way. There was a long moment of silence, broken only by the steady drumming of rain on the ground, on the roofs, on the shoulders of the assembled soldiers. Then Sergeant Willis stepped forward, his voice carrying in the darkness. The lieutenant's a good man, he said. He's been fair with us since he got here. He don't treat us like we're less than human. If he says he's going to fight for Taylor, I believe him. I'm asking you all to stand down for tonight. Go back to the barracks. Let the lieutenant do his job. And if it don't work out, we'll figure out what comes next together. Slowly. Reluctantly, the crowd began to disperse. Men broke away in small groups, their voices low and angry, but moving away from confrontation. Harrington watched them go, and when the yard was mostly empty, he climbed down from the crate and found his legs were shaking. Willis approached him, his face unreadable in the darkness. You know, they're just going to protect their own, sir. The MPs. They always do. I know, Harrington said. But I have to try. The investigation, such as it was, began the next morning. Harrington submitted his formal report, including the photographs Washington had taken of Taylor's injuries and the cardboard sign that had been pinned to his chest. He testified to what he had seen, described the MP's behavior, and formally requested courts-martial for Bowen and the others involved. Captain Foster backed him up, as did several British civilians who had witnessed the initial confrontation at the pub and were outraged by what they had seen. But the military hierarchy moved slowly, and it moved with prejudice baked into every level of decision-making. Colonel Henshaw, the provost marshal responsible for the MPs, claimed that Taylor had been violent in resisting arrest, that the force used had been necessary and appropriate. The MPs involved gave statements that contradicted the testimony of black soldiers and British witnesses, and those contradictions were resolved in favor of the white men wearing badges. Within a week, the official finding was that while excessive force may have been employed, no criminal charges were warranted. Bowen and his men received written reprimands in their files and were reassigned to different duties. Eugene Taylor spent 2 weeks in the hospital recovering from his injuries. When he was released, he was quiet and withdrawn. The light in his eyes dimmed in a way that made Harrington's chest ache every time he saw him. The cardboard sign had been confiscated as evidence, but the word remained defiant, burned into all of their memories like a brand. But something else had changed too. The soldiers of the 1511th and the other Negro units stationed around Bamber Bridge had reached a collective breaking point. They had seen one of their own beaten and marked, had watched the system fail to deliver justice, and they were done pretending that patience and discipline would earn them the respect they deserved. Tension crackled through the base like electricity before a storm. It came to a head 3 nights later at the same pub where it had all started. A group of MPs tried to enforce segregation, tried to force black soldiers out of the establishment despite the protests of the British proprietor. This time the soldiers did not leave quietly. Shouting turned to shoving, shoving turned to punches, and within minutes the street outside the old Hob Inn was chaos. More soldiers poured out of the barracks, some carrying makeshift weapons. More MPs arrived as reinforcements, and someone no one could ever agree who fired the first shot. Harrington heard the gunfire from his office and ran toward the sound without thinking. By the time he reached the scene, the street was full of running figures. The crack of pistol shots echoing off stone walls, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness. He saw British civilians fleeing into their homes, saw MPs taking cover behind vehicles, saw Negro soldiers fighting with a fury born of months of accumulated rage and humiliation. He found Willis crouched behind a stone wall, breathing hard, his face streaked with mud. "We gotta stop this, sir," the sergeant shouted over the noise. "People are gonna die." "Where's Taylor?" Harrington shouted back. A bullet whinned past his head, so close he felt the air displacement, and he ducked instinctively. "In the barracks. He tried to come out when he heard the shooting, but I made him stay put." "He's been through enough." Single quotes. Harrington nodded, then stood and began shouting for a ceasefire, his voice hoarse from the effort. Other officers joined him, both white and Negro, all of them desperately trying to impose order on chaos. Slowly, painfully, the shooting tapered off. When the smoke cleared and the ringing in his ears faded, Harrington could see bodies on the ground, some moving, some not. Medics rushed forward, and the night filled with the sounds of groaning and weeping and urgent commands. The official casualty report listed 1 white MP dead, several others wounded, and numerous injuries among the black soldiers. But the real casualty was harder to quantify. It was the illusion that segregation could be maintained peacefully, that men could be treated as second-class citizens and still be expected to serve with loyalty and discipline. Something had broken that night in Bamber Bridge, something that no amount of official reports or disciplinary action could repair. In the aftermath, the Army acted swiftly to contain the damage. Negro soldiers were confined to base, officers like Harrington were interviewed repeatedly about their actions and loyalties, and a narrative was constructed that blamed the violence on outside agitators and communist influence rather than acknowledging the racism that had sparked it. Courts-martial were held, but they were selective. Black soldiers were punished for participating in the riot, while MPs who had provoked it received minimal consequences. Eugene Taylor was among those charged with inciting to riot, despite having been in the barracks when the shooting started, and despite Harrington's furious testimony on his behalf. The trial was a farce. Taylor stood before a board of white officers who had already decided his guilt, his face still showing the fading bruises from his beating, and listened as prosecutors painted him as a troublemaker who had inspired other Negro soldiers to violence through his defiant attitude. The cardboard sign was introduced as evidence, not of the abuse he had suffered, but of the justifiable concerns MPs had about his behavior. Harrington watched from the gallery, his hands clenched so tight his knuckles went white as justice twisted itself into something unrecognizable. Taylor was sentenced to 6 months hard labor, reduced rank, and forfeiture of pay. The sentence was suspended after 3 months due to the intervention of British MPs who had investigated the incident and threatened to make their findings public, but the damage was done. When he returned to duty, Eugene Taylor was a different man, quieter, harder, the defiance that had once shone in his eyes replaced by something colder and more distant. The war continued. The 1511th Quartermaster Truck Regiment went on to serve with distinction in the European theater, driving through mud and fire to keep supply lines open, proving their courage and competence in ways that transcended the prejudice of their countrymen. But none of them forgot Bamber Bridge. None of them forgot the night they fought their own army in the streets of an English village because they had been pushed beyond endurance. And none of them forgot Eugene Taylor. Tied to a post and marked with a single word that encapsulated everything wrong with the nation they were fighting to defend, Harrington stayed with the 1511th for the remainder of the war. He fought for his men in small ways and large, pushing back against segregation where he could, documenting abuses, writing letters to congressmen and journalists who might care. Most of his efforts came to nothing, swallowed by a military bureaucracy that had no interest in change. But occasionally he won a small victory, transfer approved, a promotion granted, a Negro soldier given the recognition he deserved. It was not enough, would never be enough, but it was something. Years later, after the war had ended and he had returned to civilian life, Harrington would sometimes wake in the night with the image of that room burned into his vision, the dim lamplight, the smell of blood, Eugene Taylor slumped against the post with that cardboard sign pinned to his chest. In those moments he would lie in the darkness and wonder what had become of the young man he had tried to save, whether he had found peace or carried the scars of Bamber Bridge with him for the rest of his life. He never found out. The Army did not track such things, and black soldiers returning from the war often disappeared into communities where their service was unrecognized and their sacrifices forgotten. But Harrington remembered. He told the story whenever he could, whenever someone would listen, even as the official records minimized what had happened and the military's version of events erased the truth in favor of comfortable lies. He told it because Eugene Taylor and the men of the 1511th deserved to have their story heard, because what they endured was not just a historical footnote but an indictment of the nation they served. The rain never really stopped in Lancashire, but eventually the soldiers left. Bamber Bridge returned to its quiet existence, a small village with a secret history etched into its stones. The locals remembered, though. They remembered the black American soldiers who had been kind and respectful, who had been welcomed into their homes and pubs, and who had been punished by their own countrymen for that simple human decency. And when the years passed and people began to talk about the good war, the righteous crusade against fascism, the locals would sometimes shake their heads and tell the story of the night the village became a battlefield, not because of Germans or bombs, but because of the color line that America brought with it across the Atlantic. Eugene Taylor's name appears in few official records. His service file notes his court-martial and suspended sentence, but says little else. The photograph of him tied to that post, marked as Defiant, was filed away in some archive where it gathered dust for decades before being discovered by historians who, when it finally came to light, it shocked people with its brutal clarity. Here was the ugly truth of segregation. The cruelty of racism laid bare in a single image that no amount of revisionist history could erase. The men who beat him, who tied him up and burned him with cigarettes and pinned that sign to his chest, their names are lost to history. They went on with their lives, most likely, returned home after the war and told stories about their service that conveniently omitted their crimes. They were protected by a system that valued white authority over black humanity, that saw discipline as more important than justice, that allowed brutality as long as it was directed at the right targets. But the story survived. It survived in the memories of the soldiers who were there, who saw what happened and carried it with them. It survived in the records kept by British authorities who were appalled by what they witnessed. It survived in the photographs and documents that Harrington insisted be preserved even when he was pressured to destroy them. And it survived in the legacy of the 1511th Quartermaster Truck Regiment, who served with honor in a war that did not honor them, who proved their worth to a nation that refused to see it. Lieutenant James Harrington died in 1987. an old man who had practiced law for 40 years and raised 3 children and never quite shed the guilt of not having done more for Eugene Taylor. His obituary mentioned his war service briefly in a single line, with no reference to Bamber Bridge or the night he found a soldier tied to a post. But in his papers, carefully preserved and donated to a military history archive, there was a folder labeled simply "Justice Denied." Inside were the photographs, the testimony, the letters he had written, and the responses he had received, and a single piece of cardboard with a word written in grease pencil: Defiant. It was not the word the MPs had meant it to be, not in the end, because Eugene Taylor had been defiant, not in the way they claimed, not in resisting arrest or causing trouble, but in the simple act of existing as a black man who refused to accept that his humanity was negotiable. And in that defiance and that refusal to be diminished, he embodied something larger than himself. He embodied the resistance of every black soldier who served in a segregated military, who wore the uniform of a nation that treated them as less than equal, who fought for freedoms abroad they were denied at home. The rain fell on Bamber Bridge the night Eugene Taylor was beaten, and it fell on the night the streets erupted in violence, and it falls there still, washing over the stones and the soil where history happened and was forgotten and is slowly being remembered again. The village has a plaque now, a small recognition of what occurred there in 1943, when American racism collided with British decency and black soldiers said enough. It does not tell the whole story. No plaque could, but it is a start, an acknowledgement that what happened mattered, that the men who fought and suffered there deserved to be remembered. And somewhere in the archives, in the folders and files that historians sift through looking for truth, that photograph remains. A young black soldier, battered and bound, marked with a word that was meant to shame him but instead became his testament: defiant, not broken, not defeated, not silenced even by those who tried so hard to silence him. Just defiant in the face of everything that sought to crush him, still standing in the only way that mattered, by refusing to disappear, by insisting on his humanity, by being remembered. The war ended. Fascism was defeated. The world celebrated victory and moved on. But the soldiers of the 1511th and all the other Negro units who served in segregation, they came home to a country that had not changed, that would not change for decades more, that demanded they wait patiently for the rights they had bled to defend. Some waited, fought. Some, like Eugene Taylor, carried their scars in silence and let the years pass without recognition or apology. But the story endured, as stories do when they contain truths too important to be buried. And in that endurance, in that stubborn refusal to be forgotten, there is a kind of victory. Not the victory the soldiers deserved, not justice or recognition or even basic decency, but the victory of being seen, finally, for who they really were. Not troublemakers or threats or second-class citizens, just men, American men, soldiers who served, who suffered, who defied the forces that sought to diminish them simply by continuing to exist, to serve, to hope that someday the nation they fought for would finally live up to the ideals it claimed to represent. That day came slowly, far too slowly for the men who endured Bamber Bridge and places like it, but it came. And when it did, the stories of soldiers like Eugene Taylor became not just historical curiosities, but essential testimony to the long, painful journey toward justice. They became proof that courage takes many forms, that heroism is not just charging into battle, but also surviving with dignity in a system designed to destroy it. They became finally what they always should have been, a mirror held up to America, reflecting back the contradiction at its heart, that a nation founded on the principle that all men are created equal could treat its own soldiers, its own citizens, as if they were less than human. The rain falls still on Bamber Bridge. The stones remembered, and the archives and the memories and the stories passed down and finally told. Eugene Taylor remains, defiant, unbroken, a testament to the thousands like him who wore the uniform and bore the burden and never received the honor they earned. Not forgotten, not anymore, never again.